Medieval conspiracy. All right, let's talk about it. First of all, obviously I didn't have a whole hell of a lot of fun with this one, but that doesn't mean I don't have some hopes of it. It's just the game went out of its way to make learning it particularly difficult and painful. And that's a Eurogame trademark, really, making games difficult. I've only played one other of his games, which was Assyrian Wars, and that was painful in terms of the rules, but it was worth digging through to get to, because there was a very good CDG under there, or at least a fairly good one. And the best representation of that period as a military, as a strategic war game that I've seen, which makes me say very good, because, well, if it's the best that I've seen, okay, maybe not, because I still haven't found my Revolutionary War game, right? But this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I came at this with a fair amount of willingness to try and puzzle this out. The problem is, of course, what I first saw with the game, which was, damn, man, it looks like a Euro. Before I even bought it, when I was debating the pre-order, it looks like it's going to be a Euro. And it is a Euro. It's a bloated, in terms of fiddly actions, poorly written rule set, garish components that don't serve their purposes, but in the end it's still a Euro. With some capacity for player interaction and direct player attacking one another. But this is no, in the course of my game, I think we played one battle. I don't see combat being a major part in the game. I don't see a whole hell of a lot of being able to hurt someone directly. But it's an auction, and auctions are competitive in nature. So there are a lot of Euros that have that competitive nature to them. I think about the fact that, what kept me from designing a medieval game, a medieval Holy Roman Empire game, and one of the things was the map. And the map for this game, hideously colored, etc., that it is, what it reminds me a little bit of is the Elric map, but less readable. But the thing that really kept me from doing it was, these territories are too big. When I looked at a map of the Holy Roman Empire at any given time, the little territories that were individual states, there were far more than are displayed on this map. That's a concession that is kind of the reason I can't design games, right? Because I look at that and say, well, I can't abstract away the actual nations or states or whatever. So, there has to be Hesse Darmstadt and Hesse whatever, So that is one reason, why I have to go out and buy a game on the subject, even if I know that it's not going to meet my needs, because I'm not going to make the game that would meet my needs. I'm incapable of it, just like I would be incapable of some of the concessions that went into EU, or really almost any game. Role-playing games, I've been able to make some concessions. Not that I'd publish them, but the components themselves are somewhat problematic. First of all, the cards are beautiful. They smell wonderful. And they shuffle fine. But there's a little bit of additional information that could perhaps be presented on them. I discussed that during the play. One thing on the board that would be very useful, I can tell you, is the bishoprics They do say BM on them, but it's so hard to read anything associated with the name. So like, and then there's also other things. So BM Dinnerbrook is a bishopric, as is Munster. But Hism and Oft and all these other things are not, and there's no reason that their name is any differentiation, that initial, what type of title they are. And obviously, the electorates are also not titled in that way. So what I suggested was, hey, if there was a cross on all of the territories that were religious territories, that would help. It would help identify something important that isn't readily visible from the map itself. But the map is very garish and busy already, so adding more information to it wouldn't work terribly well. The worst thing about the map that I found has to do with these trade routes, where, hey, you connect two cities. Yeah, well, that's not a good example. You connect two cities, and you have a little coin on it, and that indicates that there's an extra buck if you own those two cities yourself, or the territories they're in. But some trade routes kind of split and fork all over the place, and they're to indicate, hey, there's a buck to go here, I think, again, not clear from the rules, a buck to go up here, a buck to go up here, whatever, and that there's actually quite a bit more money that can be made on the trade than is visually very obvious to the player. Or maybe the rules, which are unclear on the point, indicate something else. So who knows? But that's the only way that I could read those. The wooden blocks, oh man. So these were a bitch and a half for me. So you have wooden blocks for control markers and wooden blocks for armies. And they're all the same kind of blocks, and then you have these kind of black peat blocks that have kind of a gray colored sticker on them, which I found easily confused with the gray pieces. Obviously, if you have a colorblind impairment, or color perception impairment, if you're colorblind, it's going to be more difficult no matter what with most games. But in this case, I found myself having difficulty with things that could have easily been presented a little bit differently. But anyway, the profusion of blocks and the choices of which things to have blocked and stickered is odd, to say the least. So with all those blocks on the board, it doesn't pop out, like the armies don't pop out at you, nor do the control markers. If they were at different elevations, if the control markers were cardboard and the armies were wooden blocks, I think that's the best solution. Then the blocks, the things that are movable, that can do something on the board and that are an actual threat, would kind of pop out and say, hey, here I am. Whereas the informational counters, which are more like the board itself, would be recessed to the board level. And I think that would be a better design decision. What certainly is not a good design decision is to have everything in the same shapes and same sizes, all jumping out at the same place. And what is really terrible was having hit markers for the knights on little wooden blocks, or for any of the units really, and then the additional hit markers for knights alone on these little round counters. Markers that you put on pieces should not be on wooden blocks, but yeah, okay. Probably the worst of all the design decisions was writing the game in this medieval font. And the rules are readable, but you have to inch your way through trying to discern, because these are not the easiest type of fonts to read. So what do you end up with? Well, unless you love reading medieval manuscripts and can speed read them for clarity and whatever, you end up with a print and play set from the rulebook. Now, I hate living rules because they force you to do this if you want to play by the most modern rules. But you know what? In most games, a couple of GMT fuck-ups like One by the sword and trying to remember what it was. Supreme Commander are exceptions. They reprinted the whole rulebook. Lincoln's War by MMP is an exception. They didn't reprint the rulebook, gave you living rules. Have fun with that. Yeah. So, at least those, though, were screw-ups of somebody just didn't develop the game enough. We got plenty of that here. For a Euro, an outstanding amount of didn't develop the game enough. But the decision to take an unreadable font and to not pass this to playtesters in this format and say, what do you think? And then, for 95% of the population, or the people who actually read rules, perhaps, I don't know, whatever. Maybe some people just chew on the pieces. But for anybody who wants to read the rules to the game, you have to either pull up the electronic version or print it out. And this is a waste. Totally useless. Or you can inch your way through trying to read it very slowly. That same kind of font issue shows up on the cards. It shows up on the map board. It's only really terrible when you're reading the rules, although it definitely makes the cards harder to quickly discern. It makes it harder to recognize locations on the map and, sort of orient yourself if you know some of German topography. Shows up on the combat chart with the explanation of how to use this sucker. Again, all the modifiers are in medieval font. Now, that may be great for some kind of, I don't know, experiential side of the game, so that you can think, well, the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages were illiterate, so they wouldn't be able to read these rules and they just chew on the blocks or whatever. I hope it's not leaded paint, right? All right. The rules themselves, as I've alluded, are fairly poorly developed. The first crazy decision, and at first I kind of liked it. In concept, it's not a bad decision, is to put this important game concepts. Hey, this is better than a glossary. It's not just a line, FAC stands for Faction Action Control. What? Okay. And maybe a little bit of explanation of that. But, it gives a description of the action cards. It's kind of like a component, tells you a little bit about them, talks about the active player and that concept, talks about the auction, whatever. But what's really weird is some of them are disastrously lacking in the information they need to provide. For example, the auction doesn't really tell you anything about how an auction is handled in the game. They're all handled the same way, I guess, and one assumes that they're handled kind of as a standard auction of some sort. Well, when I think of a standard auction, I think of a bunch of people in the room, and, hey, do I hear $5? Do I hear $5? I got 5. Do I hear 7? 7 over here, 7 over here. That's what I think of when I hear auction. Now, if it's a game auction, like in Bridge, okay, goes the turn sequence and everything, and that seems to be what's meant here, but there's no description of it, and there are, literally dozens of different kinds of auctions that games could have. You can have a sealed auction, you can have a this, you can have a that. To not specify that is a bit of a crime. To create a section that discusses the game concept of auction and does not go into that, that's just ridiculous. Likewise, bribery. You can apparently give something to other players. The concept of bribery is that it's not allowed unless otherwise specified. The rules that specify it just say you can bribe someone as though they're referring to this. Maybe they needed to cut a paragraph out of the rules and said, well, okay, that's obvious, it's not at all clear what you could offer somebody to bribe. Obviously, you could say, I won't go here if you don't go there, or I'll let you have this if you... Okay, that's fair. Can you hand money? There are no rules that say you can, but the implication of bribery is that that would be allowed there. Can you hand cards? Some games are pretty restrictive about that. I chose to go with you can hand off money and nothing else, because everything else kind of represents stuff that maybe players shouldn't have control over anyway, like cards, I don't know what else. Provinces. Being able to hand your family's province away. Land didn't tend to be that transferable. You couldn't... There were cases where there were exchanges, though. And that's one of the reasons that I'm kind of not sure what's intended here. However, the mechanisms, as we swiftly try to move away from the word mechanics in a botched effort, the mechanisms of transferring land that you're squatting on, perhaps with your own troops, would require more rules. So that, I think, obviously, there's a hard line on that side. You're not going to be able to transfer land. And then there's varying degrees. Well, can you not make promises except when bribery is explicitly allowed? Is there no table talk in those circumstances? Or is it that you can't move money at that point? And can you ever move money or cards or what? You know, again, all left up in the air for you to decide. And this is the goofiest thing. After those two examples, the entirety of the combat rules is slipped into this important game concept. It's not some general idea of combat. The entirety of combat, including examples, is here. And then we go on to other things. Death of the Emperor. The election of the Emperor is handled elsewhere in the rules. But all the rules the rules are sort of split between the two sections. They're not repeated, etc. This is just the most ridiculous presentation I think I've seen in quite a while. It's laughable. So, between the component issues and coping with the rules, including their typeface, this is going to be a hard game for people to be willing to plow through, to deal with these big negatives that are sitting there. But what do you get when you play through it? Well, you get something that's kind of neither fish nor fowl. It's not a regular Euro, that's for sure. It's some sort of hybrid when it comes down to it. But it's not a Euro in the sense of everybody building their own little engine and working on it themselves. First of all, you've got the bidding to get in the way of that. But you do have a certain amount of dicking each other over in it. And at the very end, you also have combat. And it's a game in which you can play certain take-that type of cards against each other. Killing off each other's resources, etc. Means of their children. But the problem is, it's not sort of that light Ameritrashy feel either. It doesn't have that, oh, okay, I'm going to push a bunch of troops in and roll some dice. You suck, right? It does not have that feel at all. The thinking in it is closer to the Euro type thing. Now, you could say, well, there are hybrid Euro AT type games like Twilight Imperium or whatever. Yeah. And maybe if there's enough gameplay here, it would be worth that. And the final thing is, the thing that would really drive someone to say, okay, fuck it, I'm going to push through this, I'm going to figure it out, I'm going to make up rules that are needed, clarify things in my head, or else ask people online who probably have no authority whatsoever, what their opinion is on it, and then take that as gospel somehow, which happens with all too many games. But the thing that would drive people to do that is if this really captured the spirit, feel of the era. If it really sort of simulated things to some extent. If it really covered the topic. It doesn't do that. It's certainly no serious simulation of the topic, but beyond that, it's also doesn't really correlate very well even on an abstracted level. There are just way too many things that feel like they're just pure gamey type mechanisms, that they belong in an AT or Euro style game. And that is, kills out the one audience that might have been willing to deal with this. Like I was willing to deal with Assyrian Wars. Assyrian Wars is no great, detailed simulation of warfare in an era when we have very little idea of what warfare was like. Like the Great Battles of History series is. But it did present a believable storyline within that era. And this does not do that. And to me, well, disappointed, because that's what I would have hoped for. Even though it looked Euro-ish, I had hopes that it would present a very rich storyline about the family dynastics and everything. It doesn't. Family members are just little tokens that you put aside so you can claim things. They're a form of resource, really, more than anything else. Although you could probably say that about what I would see as them as well. It's just they don't have interrelationships. They're not actual people. They're not fleshed out as anything. They're just blocks that mark territories. And the availability of those blocks is determined by whether you put them in a clerical or profane training. So in the end, you have kind of this kind of clunky hybrid. One other component issue that got in the way was all these tracks. Now this may be a personal problem, but I had a lot of difficulty keeping, especially the income tracks. And there's two different income tracks, one for trade income and one for your total income, which is down here. It's not too exciting. It looks kind of like this, only it's bigger. And then this one's for keeping track of how many knights you have in play, which is pretty easy to count, or how many soldiers you have in play. This one's how many relics you have in play. I found those harder to see because they kind of blend in with the gray pieces. There's some of these here that aren't just all that obvious what you've got. The hardest part was counting the trade route income. The other income was not trivial either, just in terms of keeping it up to date at all times. The problem with it is that some games use the tracks as an integral part of the game. Here they're just something that you're keeping track of, things that are already stated on the board. So it becomes important to keep them up to date so you have your income and you don't have to all count your income each turn, so that you know who has certain cards that go to bonuses, a la the Settlers of Catan, Longest Road, and stuff like that. You have one of those for war, one of those for richest trade, and one of those for relics. Like in a previous game that I had a real problem with this, Dominant Species, assessing from the board state changes to these track changes means that I have to take 2 steps. Whereas in most games, I only have to take 1. It's either the board or the track that's kind of definitive. There are other games that handle tracks in this way, but it tends to be an obnoxious step because you're focused on one thing, the board, which is the actual real representation of the game state, and then you have this play aid that you have to keep up to date all the time. And that becomes a chore that's just difficult for me. So yet another little barrier that's in the way, along with all these others. Ambiguity of the rules is a huge one. You're going to have to make up your own stuff, or else believe somebody else's made up stuff. But, and that's what playing a game is all about, right? You're believing those rules, which are made up stuff by the designer, so it's what we do. But the actual gameplay doesn't strike me as energetic and engaging enough to be an AT-style game. Thoughtful and rewarding of good strategic choices enough to be a good Eurogame, and finally it doesn't give enough of the story to be what I was seeking. This is a game that probably should have never been published. Certainly not in the form that it eventually was. It would be an okay enough game from what I can see if everything was clean in it. If the rules were well written, if the components, kind of optimized your experience a little bit better than they do. Not a great game, because there's a lot of luck in it. And it's not the kind of luck that the AT player generally tends to like. It's not a rolling the dice and I beat you on this or something. It's not a, oh yeah, well, like in Cosmic Encounter, I've got this flare which cancels out your whole plan. It's not that kind of thing. What my game came down to was your starting draw. The starting draw. I could predict who was going to win from that almost assuredly. Just because they had access to stuff that no one else did. Now, that's better, I guess. I usually complain most bitterly when a game has late game luck, because I find that kind of breaks the whole game. It's one thing to get a jump from luck, or for a game to just have luck running through it all throughout, and you just live with it. This doesn't feel like it has a whole hell of a lot of luck running through it. It has a fair amount. There's the cards you draw, there's the die roll on your fate table, whether or not you get a child or an ability to intervene in some and bid on some other territory. But those generally didn't add up to too much. And given that every card could be traded with $80 for a mercenary, you had a capability to build up troops. Nothing was totally useless. There's a fair amount of being able to take down the leader, which would seem like it would mitigate that luck. But I didn't find that it was the case. Maybe I waited too long. Basically, what you can do is you can kill off all their children, and then they can't expand at all. You can freeze them that way. But that requires a certain amount of luck, which is to say, in the 6-player game, no one had any cards left that would wipe out children, and I think everybody used such cards on the leading player, and yet he still was able to get to a position in which there was nothing anybody could do, but it came close. It came close to being able to be extended a little longer. Not it came close to somebody else winning. I don't think the game would have had to be a lot longer than I think the game can possibly be for that to happen. There's almost a built-in timer on this game, because as the neutral electorates disappear, there's really nothing preventing someone from winning the game. Now, if that initial deal wasn't so lopsided, and maybe in 6 players it's likely to be lopsided, I'm not sure, but basically one player was able to build a little wall and have everything behind it as his playground if he ever needed it. He didn't need most of it. You really don't need that much expansion to win this game. For your average Euro player, or maybe kind of hybridish Euro player with some conflict, Wallenstein's a much better game on the same kind of topic. And you get to drop pieces into a tower, which is more AT feeling, and it's just kind of cooler in every way. If you want this topic, I'm sorry, it doesn't really exist. I can point to one other really badly failed attempt. Well, I can point to 2 other, one that I covered actually, which is In the Shadow of the Emperor, or something like that, which is just a pure Euro, and it's kind of fun, but, and I probably kind of trashed it because it's not what I want, you know, and neither is this. But it's kind of a neat little game, and it's okay. A little bit of a headache, but whatever. It's a Euro. And a fairly light one. The other one is Popes and Princes, which is really an unfinished game. It ended up getting turned into an online back in the days of Genie. I don't know if Genie's still around in some form or another, but back in the days of Genie, it was being played as kind of this massively multiplayer role-playing where you're playing noble factions, families, whatever. You have like one. Yeah, you could be the King of France. You could be the Pope. My housemate was the Pope actually in it. Or you could be like I was, just some doinker shit. I think I was the Prince of. I don't remember what I was. That was in a later. There's a later version of this thing that I played around 2000, and it's really kind of a neat design idea, but it was an incomplete game when it was published as a little, hey, here's a game you can play. Yeah, if you make up what's essentially a huge role-playing game out of it. The eventual online version that I did play around 2003 was I believe completely automated. So they had gotten rid of the game master element to it, I think. I'm not positive, but you moved pieces around and everything, and it had lost a lot of its flavor by that. It had to be so pared down to handle that. But anyway, yeah, I really cannot recommend this. I'll give it more play. I'm going to try to convince my wife to play it. She liked the idea of the way it looked and the components and everything. I find them garish, but she's an artist, so what do I know? And try to salvage some value out of it, because I think it is a fair game under there. It's just you shouldn't have to work this hard for a merely fair game, right? It's got to be something astounding and blow me away like Europa Universalis did to be worth the kind of work that this or Universalis requires. All right, send it up.